Chapter 74, Sleepless, Antony's POV. Antony couldn't sleep. It wasn't just because of the pain in his back. He was tired enough to sleep through worse agony than that. The real trouble was that the bed felt huge and cold around him, no matter how tightly he clutched the blankets. He wished Hanyu had done as he was told and put him on the sofa. If there had been less space, perhaps he could have settled down a little. Another disobedience. The young man hadn't even seemed to notice that he was defying Antony's orders that time, which hardly soothed his fears that he had already lost any chance of curtailing his offering's behavior. He had to try, though. As soon as he was better, he would... What punishment would he give? What would even be effective? A whimper from the sitting room pulled him out of his brooding. It was followed by another, even louder and more woebegone. "Hanyu?" he called. There was a moment of silence, and Antony thought he'd succeeded in waking his offering. Then the young man moaned again, putting an end to those hopes. "Hanyu!" he called again, but there was no response. Nothing for it, then. Antony squirmed out of bed. The pain was intense enough to make him dizzy, and he swore under his breath as he stood. Hanyu's blood had apparently done its work. His legs took his weight this time, though they trembled violently under him as he staggered the few feet to the doorway, where he clung for support and looked over the sitting room and his attendant. Hanyu wasn't sprawling over the sofa like he did in the bed or cot. He was pressed against the back as though he was afraid of falling off. His big, lanky body was completely rigid, and Antony could see tears on his face. He let out another soft whimper. Antony stepped away from the doorframe and tottered across the room, almost striking his foot on the table. "Just a little further. I had a whole bowl of blood and seconds from Hanyu. I can fucking make it a dozen steps. Now 10 steps. Just a few more and I can..." Finally, he crashed to his knees beside the couch. The movement tore a whimper of his own from his throat, but it was drowned out by Hanyu's low keening. What kind of nightmare must the poor man be having? "Hanyu." This time, the name was accompanied by a gentle shake of the young man's shoulder. "It's just a dream, Hanyu. Wake up." His tone wasn't as soothing as he'd wanted it to be. The act of reaching up and nudging Hanyu's shoulder sent screaming pain all through his back, and he found himself speaking through gritted teeth. What's wrong with me? It was no good trying to rouse someone from a nightmare by growling at them. Hanyu's eyes flew open, and Antony felt something in his chest wrench painfully at the fear in them. "Please!" the young man whimpered, and Antony was afraid he might start crying himself. "Easy," he tried, straining to keep his arm raised and his hand on his attendant's shoulder. "You're all right." Bleary and tearful, Hanyu stared at him for a long moment before curling around Antony's shaking hand and clutching it in his own. Antony hadn't realized until that moment how afraid he'd been that Hanyu would recoil from him. Despite the anguish of his back, Antony relaxed. "I thought I was your nightmare." "It was just a dream," he said, even gruffer in his relief. Hanyu just cradled his hand, pressing his cheek to it. The rush of sensations almost made Antony jerk back, when even agonizing pain could not. There was the wetness of tears and the wild heat of Hanyu's skin, but what startled Antony was the faint scrape of bristle. It had been so long since Antony, or anyone he knew, had shaved, that he'd forgotten about the ritual entirely. He'd simply assumed that the way a person looked on any given day was the way he looked every day. Perhaps it was the memory of shaving side by side with Valerius, the two of them crowding and elbowing one another over a single basin, even though there were plenty of others available. Perhaps it was the idea of Hanyu's body changing every instant, even while he slept. Whatever the reason, Antony realized that he would not be taking Julia's very reasonable advice. "Come back to bed." Finally, his voice had softened. "You can tell me about it there." Hanyu looked up, face shiny with tears in the darkness, and sniffed so loudly and wetly that Antony winced. But Lord Julius said..." Withdrawing his hand, Antony had to swallow a gasp of pain. "I'll do more harm dragging my sorry carcass out here to wake you from nightmares." "Oh, no!" Hanyu's eyes bulged. "You're out of bed! Why did you..." The young man scrambled off the couch, his bare foot landing heavy and soft and harmless on Antony's knee. This resulted in a wail from Hanyu. I'm sorry, he cried. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, Hanyu, breathe, it's fine. The young man flopped gracelessly to his knees beside Antony. No, it's not! I made you get out of bed and then I stepped on you! Something about his tone filled Antony's whole body with pinching, dangerous softness. He laughed, though it hurt, to be sure he wouldn't cry. Has anybody ever told you that you're very dramatic? He asked when the danger had passed. Oh, all the time, Hanyu replied. But Antony, you're hurt. Not by you stepping on me. You're not even wearing shoes. He wasn't wearing anything, in fact. Antony had always required that he at least wear underthings when they shared the bed. But apparently Hanyu had discarded even that modicum of modesty the minute he seemed likely to sleep alone. Antony caught himself looking, no, not really looking, just noticing, barely even glancing, at the long, pale expanse of his chest and stomach, the unbearable softness of his skin. He shaves there, too? How have I not noticed? He quickly looked away, back up to Hanyu's tearful, distraught face. If you're so worried about me, you can help me back to the bed, he snapped. Once again, his voice was too harsh, but Hanyu, miraculously, didn't seem to mind. Instead, the young man smiled, and something that had been tightly knotted in Antony's chest eased at the sight. Of course! With a quick swipe of his hand over his damp cheeks, Hanyu got to his feet and extended a hand down to Antony. The mere idea of letting himself be hauled up by an arm was laughable. Instead, Antony straightened on his knees and stood, 1 foot at a time, careful of his balance and pathetically grateful that the sea did not choose that moment to rock the ship. He was equally grateful for the solid bulk of his attendant as Hanyu ushered him back the handful of feet to the bed. Those few steps still felt like an epic journey, more worthy of remembrance and song than any battle Antony had ever been in, but they were vastly easier with a strong body to lean on. He collapsed face first onto the mattress, joyous beyond all reason at being able to lie down again, then turning his head to glare at Hanyu where he stood, hesitating. I told you to come to bed, didn't I? Antony grumbled. I didn't mean you should just come to stare at it. Get under the blankets before you freeze. But what if I move and tear your stitches? Hanyu protested, even as he crossed to the other side of the bed. They're already torn. Antony had no doubt of that. Anyhow, it doesn't matter. I can't get infected or scar. But it'll take longer to heal, won't it? Hanyu had obediently settled himself under the blankets, but he stayed so close to the opposite edge of the bed that he seemed likely to fall out. Not as long as it'll be if I can't sleep. Damn, how had he let that slip out? Feeling as naked as Hanyu, Antony buried his face in the pillow. Sometimes it paid not to have to breathe. I've gotten used to having you there, that's all, he snarled into the pillow. Now come on, tell me about that dream. There was another moment's hesitation, which was unusual enough coming from Hanyu that Antony pried his face away from the safety of the pillow to look at the other man. His attendant lay, long and rigid, staring straight up at the ceiling. If it's all the same to you, my lord, I'd rather not, he said timidly. It most certainly was not all the same to Antony. All right. They lay quietly for a moment. Already, the bed felt better and warmer, even with Hanyu doing his best imitation of a plank of wood as far from Antony as he could get. Despite this, Antony couldn't relax enough to sleep. His mind worried and prodded at one concern until finally he couldn't stand it any longer. If the nightmare was about me punishing you, I hope you know it won't be that bad, he said carefully. I can see why you wouldn't believe that, since I'm keeping you prisoner and I drink your blood and... There was a whole litany of crimes, but Antony shut his jaw tightly against them. There was no call for him to start babbling the way Hanyu always did. Right on cue, the young man took over where he'd left off. Oh, no, he said, rolling closer so he could skewer Antony with the sheer earnestness of his wide brown eyes. It wasn't anything like that. I'm not scared of you, though I guess that's disrespectful and I really should be. Sorry, my lord, but I'm still not. I'm definitely not afraid of your punishment, and I like it when you drink my blood and everything. Just as Antony was about to tell him to breathe, he sucked in a great gulp of air and hesitated again. This time, though, the hesitation lasted only an instant. You were in my dream, but it was only because you'd been turned into a human and there was nothing protecting you anymore. Nothing protecting you. Antony didn't need to pry any further to know what, or rather, who, his dream self had needed protection from. He felt a great surge of anger with Marcus. Why had his lover ruined any chance of friendship with Hanyu so thoroughly? It was a joy to see Hanyu getting along so nicely with Theo and Felix and Thad and everyone. How wonderful would it have been if he could have befriended Marcus, too? But Marcus had frightened the young man with his moods and his temper, and now it seemed unlikely that such a friendship could ever develop. Asshole! I'd be a terrible human, he said aloud, suddenly and inexplicably desperate to see Hanyu smile again. You seen my ridiculous little hands? I couldn't even open a jar. It worked. There was that smile, brighter in the darkness of his cabin than any sunrise Antony could remember. You already can't open jars, Hanyu informed him. Remember when you were putting ointment on me? I was trying to close that jar, not open it, Antony retorted, with all the offended dignity he could muster. Now get some sleep, will you? Julia will be battering down our door to change my bandages and yell at me for moving before you know it. It wasn't long before cavernous snores filled the air and a long arm flopped dangerously close to Antony's face. In response, he only closed his eyes and smiled despite the pain in his back. Now I can sleep.